Good evening. Welcome to tonight's conversation about the first 100 days that Donald Trump has been in the President's Office of the United States of America. My name is Linda Harling-Stalker. I'm the director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge that today we meet in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. It remains important to remember the destructive elements of colonialism that perpetuate today. As we work toward reconciliation, let us not forget the seven grandfathers' teachings of love, wisdom, respect, humility, courage, truth, and honesty. We are all treaty people. So some of you may have remembered that we met back in the fall with some of these same panelists here to talk about the upcoming American election. I remember there was much trepidation about Trump's candidacy and nerves about what the outcome would be, and no one would make a prediction. We met again in January, and if we were an episode of Stranger Things, we would feel like we were in the Upside Down. The ally we thought we could trust no longer was someone that felt trustworthy. Talk of tariffs kept our economic situation in constant flux and somewhat chaotic. Our political institutions were no longer respected, with our prime minister being called a governor. And our identity feels like it's under threat as we're continually being called the 51st state. Today's panelists come from different backgrounds with different foci on what is top of mind as the United States enters what President Trump calls its golden era. Our panelists will discuss what this might mean for Americans, Canadians, and those around the globe. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Asa McKercher, Dr. Haley Murphy, Dr. Greg Katch, and Dr. Anna Zhuslag to the stage. So let me introduce each of them to you. Dr. Asa McKercher, who is two over from me, is the Stephen K. Hudson Chair in Canada-US Relations at the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government here at St. FX. He is a specialist on American politics and on the Canadian-American relationship. His latest books include Building a Special Relationship, Canada-US Relations in the Eisenhower Era, and North of America, Canadians and the American Century. Haley Murphy, who is to Dr. McKercher's left, your right, holds a PhD from York University and is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at St. FX. Specializing in Canadian politics and the politics of the 2SL LGBTQ+ community, her research focuses on lesbian political autonomy, intersectionality, and queer rights, particularly political invisibility and the need for recognition. A proud member of the 2SL LGBTQ+ community, she connects the needs of her community with her academic work. Greg Katch, to my left, has been teaching economics at St. FX since 2010 and is a specialist in monetary policy and economic forecasting. The author of over 50 research papers, his work has been the subject of news stories in outlets such as the Globe and Mail, National Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Le Figaro. Prior to joining St. FX, he worked at the Bank of Canada and led a team that advised then Governor Mark Carney on how to navigate the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. His interest in applying economics to inform public policy make him a popular media source. His recent media appearances include CBC Radio, Chronicle Herald, and the Epoch Times, and he is frequent guest of the Rick Howe Show on News 95.7 in Halifax. And finally, Dr. Anna Zhuslag on the far left, my far left, is the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government's Program and Research Manager. Dr. Zhuslag holds a PhD in American History from Western University. Her academic research focuses on representations of masculinity during the Cold War and more specifically, images of draft resistance during the Vietnam War and Reagan eras. She's taught courses in American history, American studies, Canadian history, and US-Canada relations at Western University and here at St. FX. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. As is core to the Mulroney Institute's mandate, the speakers this evening will be modeling our values of decorum and treating all with dignity and decency. We ask this of our audience members as well. We also ask that you turn your cell phones off and not to take any videos or photos during the event. The panelists will each speak for about 5 minutes, and the floor will then be opened up to questions to follow. And I'll bring a mic around for anyone that has the questions. So with that said, let's hear from our panelists. And we'll start with Dr. Juslag on the far left.
Sorry, my name starts with a Z, so I usually go last. But my first name starts with an A, so I'm mixed up. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This is sort of an experiment for the Institute in organizing an event that's outside of the school year. So I truly appreciate you coming out and joining us tonight. Okay. I have written some iteration of this opening statement 3 times before, for October 2020, October 2024, and January 2025. The first 2 were pleas for the better angels of American nature to see why electing Donald Trump would be disastrous for the citizens of the United States, the globe, and for democracy's true believers. Yet, here we are again, 100 days into the second Trump presidency, and aren't we in a pickle? Who could have foreseen that elections have consequences? That allowing a geriatric, malignant, narcissistic, convicted felon to once again claim the mantle of commander-in-chief would leave the grand old republic and rules-based world order in utter shambles. That it doesn't matter what the price of eggs are when the agency responsible for tracking the avian flu ceases to exist with the stroke of a Sharpie in the Oval Office. Certainly not a ragtag team of scholars from a university in Nova Scotia. And it's great to get the old band back together again, but I think we really need to stop meeting like this. I think it has been the speed and ease of the destruction that has at times taken my breath away. For the American experiment, with so many generations in the petri dish, to be so easily torn asunder by craven grifters, criminals, lickspittles, and worm tongues, all exalting the great wisdom and vast knowledge of a man whose father paid someone to take his college entrance exams and who holds the word grocery as one of the most beautiful in the world, is truly terrifying. With Republicans controlling the levers of power, Donald Trump can claim the provenance of any word that he wants, though I think that Doge belongs to Elon. I knew that things were really bad when a scholar of authoritarianism, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, noted about 2 weeks after Inauguration Day that she could not think of a historical precedent for the accelerated pace at which authoritarianism was spreading through the United States government. It took Adolf Hitler about 2 years to consolidate power. It has been 104 days, just over 3 months, and many fear that the damage done to the US government is irreversible. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of federal workers have been unceremoniously fired without cause. Huge agencies have been decimated. Decades of data and research have been instantaneously deleted. Other institutions have been brought to their knees and forced to comply, or else. Thoroughly and treacherously unqualified sycophants and quacks sit in offices where decorated generals and Nobel Prize-winning doctors and experts once did the work of unconditionally protecting the American people and the world, moving the project of democracy forward for the greater good of humanity, and holding the line against disease, hunger, and creeping tyranny. The text is coming from inside the House, and it's probably being sent on Signal. We have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is turning the family legacy inside out as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We have Kash Patel, who is a podcaster hyphen friend of Gretzky, as the head of the FBI. We have a parking garage lawyer and Trump bluffer, Alina Habba, as the acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. And the Secretary of Defense, by way of the Fox Weekend show, Pete Hegseth, who happened to run 2 veterans organizations into the ground, commands the largest and best equipped military in the world. And he just can't seem to quit sharing war plans with his best gal in Broheims. There is also the director of the Office of Budget and Management, Russ Vought, or Vote. I'd like the former instead of the latter. I think that's too close to democracy to me to call him Vote. He of sinister vibes, the chief architect of Project 2025, the slayer of the deep state, the bringer of pain, and the sipper of liberal tears. And of course, we have Elon Musk, who paid some $250 million to bring on the apocalypse. Of course, he arrived in a Cybertruck with his son on his shoulders and his tech bro Doge acolytes trapped in the back seat. His slash and burn hatchet to the heart of American good governance and the projects to win hearts and minds will leave millions dead from disease, starvation, and violence. And the current stat is at least 3 million people will likely be dead in the developing world, in the global south, in Africa by the end of this year. The collective and public good, of course, will be damned. If we are lucky, perhaps that tide might turn in the 2026 midterms for the Democrats, who have yet to truly have their elbows up moment, though they seem to be sharpening their skates. If we lean into the 2026 midterms, that would mean having faith in a heavily gerrymandered state map and ever more increasing and punitive election laws seeking to further suppress the vote. But the reasons that the United States has come to this lowly place have not really been addressed. The 24-hour news cycle must still be contended with, now with near hostage-like videos of world leaders live from the Oval Office, of course, which was once decorated by Jackie Kennedy, now drowning in the gauche Tuileries of a man infatuated with gold-gilded decadent palaces of hip dictators he wants to emulate. Even with authoritarianism choking off democracy like so much ooze rising up through the sewers, the media is still pushing both sides, letting blatant lies and propaganda fly as the performing monkeys in the media circus work to normalize flagrantly unconstitutional acts as business as usual and bow down to the threat of orange-hued lawsuits. They sacrifice journalistic integrity and the public good, while all the checks and balances are being smashed and the grifters grift with immigration, gold passes, and untraceable Trump-owned meme coins. But even as I speak of the loss of democracy and American values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the speed, depth, and so far success of this upending are what is new. That is not to say that the impulse to break and remake the republic in ever more right-leaning iterations hasn't always been built into the machine. Demagoguery, populism, the deep drive for accumulating power in the wealthy few have beaten in the hearts of American leaders before. Joseph McCarthy, Boss Tweed, Huey Long, Andrew Jackson, Richard Nixon, Dick Cheney. Anti-science and anti-intellectualism were exalted in the Cold War and well before. We are watching a system being dismantled, but the infrastructure of control was always there and will survive. Communities of color have long endured generations of state violence, living under the shadow of white nationalism. Trump's second term has unmoored all pretense to propriety, laying bare the racism, misogyny, misogynoir, transphobia, Islamophobia, and fascism. Indeed, all the isms. All this with the total acquiescence and full participation of the Republican Party, with the Department of Justice on side under a flunky Attorney General and a Supreme Court flirting with the end of birthright citizenship and nuking due process. What other dominoes can fall? The chits have all been called in. Demurring on Russian geopolitical goals leaves Ukraine's survival in limbo, whereas the rest of Europe on tenterhooks. And please don't forget Taiwan, with China waiting in the wings. And of course, we have dreams of territorial conquest, shaded in the blood-red heritage of manifest destiny that could very well spill over our own red maples. Our one-time friend and ally sees us as useless in one moment and a treasure to plunder in the next. As I stated in January, fascism has come to America. Like the nothing in the never-ending story, it seems that Trump and MAGA are content to swallow everything in their path, leaving in their wake a nation breaths away from civil war, oligarchs looking for bones to pick over, and a world so much immiserated by it all. I see some hope in what appears to be a growing movement of public uprising in the United States. The madness, though, has spilled over the borders. We know that well. As global citizens, we must stand up, we must bear witness, we must act where and when we can with wisdom and knowledge. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask Dr. Murphy. Just go down the row here.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone for coming and thank the Mulroney Institute for inviting me back. Today, I'm going to talk about, of course, developments in the United States, but also with a nod that these developments, yes, are happening over the border, but have ripple effects elsewhere, including Canada. And I wanted to point out, too, that these types of policies and these types of concerns are about our shared values, regardless of what party you support, conservative, liberal, socialist, whatever. So there are shared values that we have, like fairness, compassion, the importance of making, decisions based on evidence, right? That should not have the same kind of partisan tinge to them that they have in the US. Since the beginning of 2025, the Trump administration has taken several steps that significantly impact women and the 2S LGBTQ community. And so those are the two that I'm going to focus on, as well as looking at the broader academic community as well. The changes that are happening in the US are happening through executive orders, but also through administrative memos, right? Which don't always make national headlines and aren't always something that we're aware of, a memo that goes to a department that a manager reads and has to pass down to their employees. But that said, they still mark a pretty significant shift. And so I want to share first what's happening in education and research. So in January, a set of executive orders directed at US colleges and universities was made to stop using diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as you might have heard of it before, criteria in their accreditation processes. So in plain terms, this means that universities can now be penalized for having programs that support students from underrepresented groups or for conducting research that highlights any sort of social inequality, which is important to me because that's the type of research that I do. In addition to this, researchers, as well as certain federal science and health agencies, including the National Science Foundation and Centers for Disease Control, have circulated lists of words that researchers are being told not to use and to avoid using in grant proposals and in public documents. This list is over 250 words long, but I've decided to share a selection of them here with you guys today. Some of the words that are banned from public documents are women, female, gender, transgender, Black, queer or LGBTQ or any iteration of that, gay, lesbian, non-binary. The word inequality, right? So these are words that if we have these very important agencies within the US making documents that are about these things, they can't use these words. And they're not obscure or ideological terms. Like the word woman is not an obscure term. While those ones focus on mostly women, queer folks, equity-seeking groups, I wanted to also point out some other words that have been banned, which I'll be really straightforward, is just, to me, totally inconceivable. So for example, the word clean water is banned from USDA communications. The words evidence-based and science-based have been banned from the CDC. The words cultural heritage has been banned from the US Department of Agriculture, as well as the National Endowment of the Humanities, which seems bizarre that they couldn't use the word culture in the humanities. Also, the term Gulf of Mexico has been removed or discouraged in environmental and energy reports. And the Department of the Interior and the EPA have also been told not to use this term. Another important one, which is going to come up a little bit later in my talk here, is the word mental health. The CDC and Department of Health and Human Services have been told that they cannot use the word mental health in combination with any marginalized group in any of their reporting, which is significant and very, very dangerous. And maybe one that our historians on the panel might find extra troubling is the word historically has been flagged and not been able to be used by the NSF or the Department of Education. Word historically, which is bizarre. So all of that said, when scientists are told not to use these terms, it means research into things like maternal health, racial health disparities, disability services, and any healthcare or research on marginalized groups becomes harder to fund and also harder to publish. It means that public health professionals can't properly identify who it is that is most affected by certain issues, and that seriously limits what they can do to then solve those issues. So I want to turn to look a little bit more specifically at the queer community, because since Trump's election, there's also been some disturbing statistics there, some very frightening trends. So in 2025 alone, which we're not that deep into, there have been 857 anti-gay or queer laws proposed in the United States, and 77 of them have been passed. So that's 857 proposed and 77 passed. This is compared to the year before, where 11 were passed. So that is a ginormous difference. So when people say that perhaps the queer community is taking things out of proportion, it's absolutely untrue. This is a serious issue. And it's not a coincidence. It's a direct attack on queer existence and on queer rights. So for example, healthcare for transgender people, particularly young people, has been targeted, and we're probably all aware of this. And I just want to note as well that laws that target queer people and restrict access to healthcare are not just about control in the present. They're about trying to legislate us out of the future and ensure that we will no longer exist, make it harder for us to survive, make it harder for us to thrive, and in general, be part of the social fabric. One executive order issued earlier this year cuts off all federal funding for gender-affirming care for anyone under the age of 19. And this also in the news and in the media gets kind of distorted as to what this even means. And Trump talks about things like people getting gender surgeries at school. What the majority of this gender-affirming care is for young people is puberty blockers, which are a very common, fully reversible treatment that's been used for decades, and not only for transgender youth, but for any children with early onset puberty. And these medications give families and doctors and children time to grow and decide what they want and figure out who they are without having to then go through puberty. So it just gives that extra bit of time, and going through puberty can cause immense mental health distress for transgender teens. So a study that came out in 2022 showed that access to puberty blockers during adolescence was associated with 73% lower odds of self-harm and suicide, which is, again, significant. And so blocking access to this type of care is not just a medical policy, but it's literally a life and death situation for many. Other orders have barred transgender women and girls from participating in women's sports. And I know that a lot of people will have different ideas and different opinions about this, but I want to point out, so excited about that paperclip until now. I want to point out something specific that really isn't talked about when we talk about transgender athletes in sports. So first of all, the NCAA, which is the largest college sports organization in the United States, has reported that fewer than 1% of their athletes identify as trans. And I really can't think of any other group that makes up just a small portion of the population, but yields this much national attention, especially when there are other huge, huge issues. If I was American, I'd be pretty upset that this is like the #1 national concern, this like less than 1% of athletes, when there are forest fires and all sorts of things happening in my country. So when taken together, these policies don't just affect a few people, they set a tone, and they send a message that certain people are less worthy of recognition, of fairness, of medical care, of existence, and they limit what researchers, doctors, and educators can say or do to help. So let me be clear, and this is kind of how I started, this isn't about partisan politics. It's about human dignity and the proper role of our public institutions. It's a question of justice and not political efficiency, which we hear a lot of from the Trump administration. Government should be helping us to understand problems more clearly, not making them harder to talk about. It should be about improving access to care, not creating more barriers where there weren't any. And it should be about supporting education that actually reflects the diversity of the people who live there, or people who live anywhere, I should say, and not trying to suppress it. So to kind of wrap up here, the level of government interference we're seeing in the US, I'll get a little bit of my theory head here. It's not even congruent with their ideological underpinning. So particularly when we see them regulating and controlling and targeting women in the LGBTQ2+ community, this is a stark contradiction to the administration's own stated principles. This is a government that claims to champion personal liberty in a more libertarian sense of the word, and to have limited government intervention. But if that's truly the position, small government, government out of our lives, right? Then the answer would be simple: stop intervening, right? Stop passing laws that dictate what words we're allowed to use. Stop passing laws about what research can be pursued and how people are allowed to live or identify. You cannot claim to simultaneously support freedom while also actively restricting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. McKercher.
Hi, thank you for being here. When we'd met 90 days ago or something, I think we'd made a number of predictions. Greg had spoken at length about tariffs and the Trump administration's designs to bring about economic golden age or economic chaos they panned out. I think Greg's going to talk some more about that. Haley, you'd already talked about some of the anti-queer policies that the Trump administration put in its first days. Obviously, Dr. Zishlike, you talked about a variety of kinds of different things. And I think, not to pat ourselves on the back, but all of our predictions have come true. The first 90 days or 95 days or whatever it is at the Trump administration, a lot of things have been happening at a kind of a breathtaking speed to give, I think, a lot of us who have spent much of our lives within America that at least prides itself on being a country of democracy and small L liberalism, liberty, make us, I think, scratching our heads a little bit. And just picking up on the thread that my colleague, Dr. Murphy, just mentioned, a lot of these policies are not conservative at all. They're in fact authoritarian. And so I think that's the worrying kind of thing that I think I myself had danced around a little bit 90 days ago, was the extent to which the Trump administration would pursue an authoritarian agenda. And unfortunately, they're hell-bent, I think, on doing that. So if I'd like to just pick up on maybe two threads here. One, I think, is that if most people in this audience know anything maybe about American government, it's the idea of checks and balances, that there's sort of a system of checks and balances. The wisdom of the George Washington and the founders of the American Constitution was that there'd be checks and balances. They'd fought a revolution, as we might know, to topple a dictator, a tyrant, much maligned King George III, and wanted to set up a system of government that would prevent, a single person from having such basically unchecked authority. And so they constructed sort of three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, that could all keep each other in check. And unfortunately, the legislative branch, controlled by the Republican Party, seems hell-bent on not doing its constitutional job. And so that's one of the troubling things, is that essentially the Senate and the House of Representatives are not acting as a check on executive power in the way that was envisioned by the founders. And to be fair, there is a Republican majority in both of those, so they're welcome to do the legislation, pass their legislation however they want, in partnership with the executive branch, as previous presidents have done for 250 years almost. But the problem is they're not even enforcing or ensuring the enforcement of existing laws. And so I'm going to take just two examples, similar sorts of things. One is the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, this huge distributor, billions of dollars of American taxpayer dollars to provide food aid and disaster relief and all kinds of other sorts of programs around the world. This has long been a target for conservatives in the United States who say, why are we sending taxpayer money abroad? So there's essentially a conservative majority, a Republican majority in the House. There's a Republican president. They can get rid of this agency if they want. But rather than pass a law, essentially getting rid of USAID, what the Trump administration has just said is refused to essentially apportion the budgeted money to USAID, because it would actually be politically unpopular to get rid of USAID. And there's actually a lot of support amongst at least sort of national security Republicans who like the disbursement of aid to poor people around the world. But rather than just pass a new law and go through the busy work of sort of doing legislative kind of work, the Trump administration is just not enforcing the existing law, which is to apportion the budgeted money into the budget. And so essentially the Congress should say, well, no, we've apportioned whatever it is, $80 billion. That money needs to be spent. If you don't want to spend this money, you need to change the law to get rid of USAID. And the Trump administration is just saying, no, we're not going to apportion the money. They're doing a similar thing with the Department of Education, created in the 1960s. There's a Department of Education. It oversees education across the United States. It oversees programs for special needs and different sorts of things. A long-standing goal for Republicans was to get rid of the Department of Education, a very politically unpopular thing, as you can imagine. I think many Americans like the idea of education, public education. Rather than just pass a new law getting rid of the Department of Education, the Trump administration is just not giving the money that Congress has appropriated to fund the Department of Education. And the Department of Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, of the McMahon W World Wrestling Foundation Federation, sorry, don't want to mix them up with WWF, the wildlife people. World Wrestling Entertainment, who's in charge of the Department of Education, a very bizarre thought, but it's 2025, it's just said basically, my job is to shut down the department that I oversee. But they're not actually changing the law to do so. So Congress, in theory, should push back and say, well, we've apportioned the money, it needs to be spent. But they're not. And so that's the bizarre thing. So it's the Republican Party marching in the legislative branch, not acting as the check on the executive power. Thankfully, of course, there's a judicial branch, which is able to, through the beauty of the American legal system, everyone can challenge anything. And there's too many lawyers, perhaps. There's some lawyers in this room. I don't want to offend them. I'm not going to make eye contact with them, but there you are. So the Trump administration, however, as I think we've seen with a number of court cases that have made the news, is essentially not abiding by court decisions. So just two examples. It was mentioned the Gulf of America, Trump's goal of changing the Gulf of Mexico, the Associated Press, a wire service, not a partisan political media entity at all, essentially said we're not abiding by this change. We're going to continue calling it the Gulf of Mexico because the vast majority of the rest of the people in the world call it the Gulf of Mexico. And the Trump administration says if you don't call it the Gulf of America, you will not be allowed into White House briefings, and you will not be allowed on Air Force One, and you will not be allowed into the briefings that take place at Mar-a-Lago and all the other places Trump travels. And the Associated Press said, no, we're not going to choose this. And so they were banned from attending, supposedly believing in free speech, supposed conservative principle. The Trump administration said, you can't. And so the Associated Press went to the Supreme Court, or various courts, up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially decided, no, you have to allow the Associated Press into press briefings in the Oval Office and in Air Force One. And the Trump administration said, no. How will you enforce it? And they've done a similar thing. I mean, this is maybe a silly example, perhaps, but it's a telling example, perhaps, of the Trump administration's thinking. Is this these deportations of, I know we can have a disagreement with this because we have before, illegal migrants. There's lots of illegal migrants in the United States. The Trump administration is committed to deporting many of them. There are courts to deport people. There's a legal process in the United States. This has worked for successive presidents for many years. It's kind of a perfunctory sort of process, but essentially they have their day in court. This is a fundamental principle of most sort of English, traced back in English common law, etc. That you have your day in court. Well, what they've done is just rounded people up without a day in court and sent them off to this bizarre prison that they've sort of funded in El Salvador with the bizarre sort of leader there. And so a fundamental principle, again, of most legal systems in sort of the civilized world, if you like, is that you have your day in court. And they've not even done that for a number of people, including this poor fellow, Alberto Garcia. What the hell's his last name? Anyway, Alberto is, my apologies, to him. And so this fellow and a number of other illegal migrants have essentially been caught up, and frankly some legal migrants have been caught up in this process where they've been deported without their day in court. A basic fundamental principle of law in the kind of Western legal canon for 1,000 years. No habeas corpus, etc. And so that is troubling. And of course, in America, people have sued over this, and it's gone all the way up again to the Supreme Court of the United States, which by a 9-0 decision. When does the U.S. Supreme Court agree on anything by a 9-0 decision in the current polarized Supreme Court system? Said that this man, Alberto Garcia, is due back in the United States, and the Trump administration has to facilitate his return. And the Trump administration has said no. So what we're seeing is, in these two examples, one maybe a little silly and one much more serious, the Trump administration just not abiding by the judicial check on its power. So not only is there no legislative checks, but there's no judicial checks either. And this is a very troubling sign, perhaps, of a trend towards like deep authoritarianism in the United States. And I don't say that lightly. I believe in America, the promise of America, despite being, I think as Linda knows, a kind of a loyalist, old red Tory kind of persuasion. But America has great things about it, and fortunately, we're seeing an erosion of that at a pretty rapid pace, which is very, very troubling, I think, for many of us to even kind of comprehend, to get our minds around the fact that America, perhaps doesn't stand for what it used to. So. Anyway, I'll stop there.
And Dr. Katch.
All right. Hello. Thanks for coming out tonight. So unlike my colleagues on the panel here, I'm actually going to criticize President Trump and his policies. So far, it sounds like the room's a bit divided on this issue. Just going to roam around a bit because I'm getting stiff. So when we met 100 days ago, that was just after the executive orders were signed when he had taken office. And he had signed a number of orders related to tariffs, especially on Canada, which I viewed as extremely destructive to the way our economy functions and to the jobs that are attached to these, to the trade with the United States. So as a reminder, about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 jobs in Canada depend directly on trade with the United States. So if the United States imposes tariffs on goods coming from Canada, that makes Canadian goods more expensive there. Therefore, Americans will buy less Canadian goods, which means Canadian producers of these goods will have to cut back production, lay off staff, higher joblessness, recessions, and so forth. So that's where we stood 100 days ago. And the tariffs that were initially announced were supposed to take effect on February 2nd. And my hope at the time of our last discussion was that the United States would have some kind of Trump whisperers who would get to the president and say, you know, this is not a good idea, right? Especially in the energy sector, the automotive sector. These sectors depend very heavily on products from Canada. And if the American producers have to pay 25% more for their imports or their inputs into their production process, that would cause a massive increase in production costs and therefore more inflation in the United States, which is something that Trump actively campaigned against. So lo and behold, around February 2nd, I believe a few hours before the midnight deadline, he held off on the tariffs, put a 30-day moratorium on them. So it looks like someone may have gotten to him, and but it was only a temporary reprieve. And there were also some industries that were given special consideration. So for example, the energy sector was only taxed at 10% instead of 25%. Again, noting the fact that the Americans are heavily reliant on Canadian energy exports, so they didn't want to tariff them too much. And as I said at the time, our major responses would have to be counter tariffs, because we cannot let one country unilaterally impose tariffs on us without retaliation. And even though the counter tariffs would be costly to Canadians, it's something that I believed Canadians would be willing to endure in order to send a signal to the Americans. And as I said at the time, this would probably lead to the biggest spike in Canadian nationalism since Paul Anderson's goal in 1972. And since January, we've been talking elbows up. So that looks like that came to pass. But since then, we've also had other trade measures announced by the president. He's been imposing tariffs on other countries, picking fights with China, with Europe. And on April 2nd, the date when he asked his different secretaries to report back on his executive orders from January, he announced several tariff measures against probably half the planet at the time. Now, what was shocking about this to me is that when he came out with his billboard of percentages and numbers justifying his tariffs on these different countries, to anyone who has a basic knowledge of trade data realized that these numbers make no sense whatsoever. And that was surprising that there was nobody in the White House who could alert the president saying, you know, Mr. President, if you go public with these numbers, you'll be laughed at. But worse, you'll be laughed at by the people who make investment decisions. So the biggest ally, in fact, we've had over the last couple of months have been financial markets. Because when the president imposes tariffs, announces new tariffs, markets immediately react negatively because they realize these tariffs will hurt American producers. Consequently, their revenues and profits will fall. And as a result, their stock price will fall. And we saw right after his April 2nd announcement, one of the biggest one-day drops in the stock market's history. And as a result, within hours, he reversed course and said, okay, there'll be a 90-day reprieve on these new tariffs that I just announced. So thankfully, the markets now are keeping the president in check. Because as my colleague just mentioned, the checks and balances within the American government right now aren't working. However, Trump has to react to financial markets. All right, so whenever he announces a new tariff, markets react negatively. And when he starts backing off on the rhetoric, like he has the last couple of days in trade talks with China, markets react positively. So where are we right now? I think the markets will keep the president in check. He will make these bombastic statements, but he'll have to walk them back. He cannot cause another $1 trillion loss in stock markets overnight. And I think now he finally realizes that, because it's starting to impact, closer to home in his case. I'm sure he has a portfolio somewhere that's being negatively impacted by that. So he might start realizing now that, okay, maybe we'll have to talk or walk some of these policies back a little bit. He's still talking a big talk, but right now I don't think we can take him as seriously. Consequently, I'm actually a bit more optimistic today than I was back in January. So there is finally a check on the president in terms of his insane trade policies right now. So where does that leave Canada? Well, as you know, we probably will have an election next week. We might have a prime minister, a new prime minister. We may not. We don't know yet. But for over 1 month now, since Mark Carney took office, he has not referred to the Canadian prime minister as governor. Only yesterday did he mention the 51st state again. So it looks like he's walking back the rhetoric a little bit. And one of the side effects of irritating Canadians is that Canadians now are much more nationalistic. There's a Canada first mentality. There's a willingness amongst provinces to work more closely together to remove interprovincial trade barriers. In fact, Mark Carney has made that a policy objective to achieve by July 1st of this year. That will make Canadian producers more efficient. That will, again, open up new markets for Canadian producers within Canada, and therefore reduce some of the negative impact of trade frictions with the United States. The government has also announced a $2 billion fund to help Canadian producers and workers being negatively impacted by tariffs. The Bank of Canada has reduced interest rates by 50 basis points since late January. So that's giving, again, a bit of monetary stimulus to the economy. So I think we'll get through this. And I think the worst case scenario is that we may be walking towards a renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which may have to give some concessions to the United States in return for having some of the major tariffs on some of the Canadian industries removed, because right now the Canadian steel and aluminum sectors are especially being harmed by the new tariffs that were imposed recently. So we may end up in a new world with a revised trade agreement, but it's also going to result in a new world where there's going to be fewer trade barriers within Canada and also a likelihood of more trade with the rest of the world, so therefore a greater diversity of trade. So that's where I'll leave it right now. And we'll see tomorrow what the news brings, because I can't prepare these remarks too far in advance because they change on a daily basis. But again, at least today, I'm more optimistic than I was 3 months ago. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to open the floor. If anybody has a burning question as to start us off with. Conversation going. It's good. Oh, there we go, Ian.
the Republicans in the United States surely have people with a lot of integrity, self-worth, and dignity. And how will they allow this man to continue on this path that he's on without any real pushback? I mean, the damage has been done, but there doesn't seem to be anybody who's going to stand on their own 2 feet with some self-respect and to challenge them. And Astor, you're the US Canada expert, and I'd like to hear what you perhaps have to say about that situation in the United States. Thank you.
I would say that those people, sorry, I think you said Asa, but I respond to Asa and Anna. So I don't think those people are in the party anymore. And if they are, they have been silenced through threats. We heard, I believe it was last week, Lisa Murkowski, who's a senator from Alaska, basically saying that she feels threatened. And she is one of the few senators who has voted against cabinet nominees, has voted against, she voted to impeach him. A lot of those people have either been drummed out of the party or they have been silenced.
I was going to mention Lisa Murkowski. She's a fascinating case. She's an Alaska senator. She has basically her own power centers, so she's not sort of reliant on the main. I mean, Alaska's a far away from the rest of the United States in many ways. She has her own center of power. They actually Trump people tried to push her out, and she held on through the primary process. And as you say, she took the remarkable steps of voting to impeach him. She opposed him on a variety of other kinds of things. And she, in remarks last week, said she's terrified, I think was the quote, frightened or terrified, of the death threats and things she's receiving. She's, and I don't want to date her, but in her 70s, she's there, I think, for another 4 years. Like, she could vote in many ways to oppose him on things, and retire happily at, in her mid-70s or something. But the fact that she's like afraid of death threats is very telling of what happens to those people who've stayed in the Republican Party, because again, a lot of them have left, of the sensible sort of people who believe in things like the rule of law, the Constitution. I mean, a lot of those people are gone. So, or they're, I don't know why, like George W. Bush. I'm not a fan, but he's just silent in general, which is very troubling and odd in some ways, because one of his signature achievements was PEPFAR, this antivirals for HIV. A big part of the USAID spending, saves millions of lives, particularly in Africa, but in other places. That program's ending. Many of those millions of people who will die as a result of USAID cuts were because of HIV/AIDS, and he's in silence. So it's a very bizarre situation. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a wonderful forum. Really appreciate you guys, your time. I guess my question would be directed toward Dr. Katz. It's about market manipulation and whether there's any truth to when Carney went to Europe to meet with the leaders of France and Great Britain. They talked about the bond market, and I don't by any means understand how it works. But what I understand is there's a large number of holdings through Canada and Great Britain and France in particular, just to speak of those three, that if they decided to use it as a leverage, which I'm not sure if there's any truth to this, that they did decide to use it as a threat to manipulate Trump into standing down a little bit. Did you hear anything about that? And if it indeed is a conspiracy theory that hasn't been fact checked, would it be something that could be used to manipulate him? You talked a lot about the stock market. I'm not sure if bonds are traded there or not, but what are your thoughts on the whole idea of using the bond market as a manipulative tactic to have him stand down?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think individual countries in terms of their central bank bond holdings are able to have a big impact on market movements just because these markets are so liquid and there's so much debt circulating that it's difficult for any central bank to be able to have a big impact on the market. But what we have observed, interestingly, over the last 3 months is basically a flight of capital out of the US dollar. So a lot of investors around the world are holding fewer US dollars because they are concerned about the state of the US economy. They're selling off American stocks. They're selling off American bonds. They're holding fewer dollars and they're going into other assets. They're going into Canadian dollars. The Canadian dollar has appreciated in the last 3 months, which is completely counterintuitive if the tariffs had taken effect immediately, which would have caused the Canadian economy to tank right away. So 3 months ago, we were at 69 cents US. Now we're at 72 cents US today. Price of gold has gone up, which is another good indicator. It is at an all-time high at $3,300 an ounce right now, which suggests a flight out of US dollar into alternative assets. So a lot of investors right now I see are being spooked by the president's policies, and it's being reflected by a movement of capital out of the United States, which is the opposite of what he wanted to achieve.
I'm going to piggyback on this one because I didn't get quite to talk about everything I wanted to in my 5 minutes. It's not directed at anyone. I don't know. Because there's so much to talk about is what I mean. What I find fascinating about the past 100 days, or maybe a little more if we include maybe his threats to Canada, which sort of began in, I think, the 20th of November or something, was when he and Justin Trudeau had their Mar-a-Lago dalliance, is the extent to which Donald Trump has wrecked American power, if you like. So the flight away from America, the American dollar as kind of the world's reserve currency, is shocking to see. The destruction of kind of key relationships with allies, Canada being one of them, but many around the world in Western Europe and other places, is a shocking thing to see. The closure, cancellation of, or planned cancellation, I think I think 3 dozen embassies is what Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, has just announced, mostly in Africa. They plan to basically shutter the vast majority of their embassies in Africa. And basically, I don't want to sound like a geopolitical hawk here, but basically to cede Africa to China is a bizarre thing to see. There's a G7 summit in Kananaskis in 2 months. It'll be very interesting to see how that works when he's pissed off so many American allies. Pardon my language. And cancellation again of things like USAID, pulling money out of the United Nations and various other international organizations that the American government set up in 1945 and that have enhanced American power and prestige for the last 80 years. It's a shocking series of developments. It's really mind-boggling to conceive, because the people in this room, we've grown up in a world basically shaped by America, for good or bad. I think probably if we can't calculate it all up, probably for the better, but that's just me. And the Americans are essentially planning to basically overturn that. It's a remarkable sort of, I think what will be one of the long-term developments here is just the ceding of and ruination of American power, prestige, and in a matter of months. It's pretty wild to see. Anyway, happy thought.
Thanks so much for a great panel. Really appreciate all your insights. Just a question about, I guess, start with foreign policy. Dr. McKercher, to anyone on the panel, really, have you seen any kind of revitalization or like renewed energy in Canadian foreign policy efforts over the last months? Obviously, it's a kind of an odds time, election going on, some kind of caretaking going on in many kind of portfolios. But have you seen kind of a renewed energy or focus or effort on the foreign policy side from the Canadian context?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a ballot issue for Monday's election, but I do think it fits with what is a ballot issue for many people, which I think is how to deal with this more aggressive country on our border, and a world that's been in disarray for a while, but that seems increasingly in disarray. And so I think whether that's what Canadians are actually voting on or not, defense and foreign policy issues are at the forefront in a way that they're not normally at election time. And so, no offense to the NDP here or something, but the two parties that will, one of them which will form government on Monday, have both promised oodles more cash for defense and oodles more cash for projects in the north, in the Arctic. I mean, to be fair, the NDP has too. So anyway, not to make fun of NDP people, which I think what's missing is the strategy that we're going to spend more on defense, but for what purpose? Because part of the problem is our military is really geared to plug into the American military. And if we don't really trust the Americans anymore and they're saying threatening things about us, we don't want to do that anymore. So there's some kind of steps that need to be thought through, but what is our military actually for, perhaps? Is it to defend our sovereignty? Is that mission number one? Is it to be deployed to Europe, as it partly is now? Is it to cooperate with the Americans? Is it to deploy to, a mission overseas somewhere in support of our allies? We got to kind of think about that, but that's for the later. But I think the fact that people are talking and there seems to be a willingness to spend more on defense is, I think, a sense that we have that the world is a lot less safe than it used to be. That certainly has been for many decades. And the fact, I think, that we're kind of waking up to something that many Canadian nationalists have said since the days of George Grant in the 1960s, that we are far too reliant on the United States, not only economically, perhaps, not only culturally, perhaps, but certainly in terms of our defense and foreign policy. And so I think there's a greater willingness to spend more to defend ourselves, not only from the Russians or something in the north, but maybe also to defend ourselves from our neighbor to the south. And I think in terms of kind of foreign policy terms too, there's a kind of a sense that we need to actually put a major effort into diversifying our trade links, as Greg noted, with other countries, something that John Diefenbaker talked about in the 1950s and Pierre Trudeau talked about in the 1970s. And Jean Chrétien launched these Team Canada missions to Indonesia and China in the 1990s, and Stephen Harper signed a record number of trade agreements when he was prime minister 15 years ago. But we never really capitalized on because our business community likes to trade with America. It's right there. It's the world's largest market, or whatever. It's the largest economy, a great market to our south. It's very easy to do that. Most Canadians live within 100 miles of the Canada-US border. So of course, a lot of our goods would be shipped there. And I think we're now coming to see, we have a free trade agreement with the European Union. We have a free trade agreement with, I think 15% of the global GDP through the Trans-Pacific Partnership with a whole series of countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We actually now need to capitalize on those kinds of things. Selling lobster to the Philippines, selling lobster to Vietnam, selling lobster to Chile. I'm just thinking of a kind of an example here, right? Shipping our lumber maybe, not south, but across the Atlantic, in terms of kind of local issues here. So I think there's a kind of a willingness and a sense that we actually need to do these things. And whether that peters out or whether that feeds into the nationalism of the moment and will be a serious effort by the government, well, I guess we'll see.
Basis for the whole tariff situation in the first place. What I hear is it to enhance production and employment in the United States. Sometimes we hear it is a big cash grab to bring dollars into the United States. And we also hear that it's a trade imbalance, which seems to be the nature of how we put together is tariffs. So what's the rationale that made that happen and why now?
Give it a shot. I think if you look at Trump's base of support, it's mostly in the industrial heartland of the United States, what would be known as the Rust Belt, where a lot of manufacturing jobs have gone away over the years. So I think he's trying to cater especially to that constituency by bringing back, or at least by bringing back the production to the United States that is currently being performed outside of the United States. And hopefully by imposing these high tariffs, that will encourage, for example, automotive companies to relocate from Canada to the United States, build their parts and assemble the cars there instead of doing that in Ontario. it would hopefully, they want to encourage, for example, aluminum smelters to close in Canada and relocate to the United States, creating the production there and bringing the jobs with them. So in Trump's viewpoint, he's just going to do this magically overnight. But obviously, in this kind of situation, you cannot build $1 billion aluminum smelter overnight. You don't have the human resources to staff this kind of facility overnight. And I was reading, just as an example, in the aluminum sector, if they wanted to replace all of their Canadian aluminum imports with domestically produced aluminum, they would have to build 6 smelters at over $1 billion each, and they would have to build 7 nuclear reactors just to power those smelters. So it is inconceivable that this could be done overnight, and in fact, inconceivable that this could be done over the next 10 or 15 years. But in Trump's world, he wants to set the framework so that businesses will start doing that kind of movement or relocation of production from other countries to the United States. So the low-lying fruit is what I'm most concerned about, though. So things like the Michelin factories in Nova Scotia, that's low-lying fruit that could probably easily move production to the Carolinas. So these are the kinds of businesses that I'm most concerned about, and those are the kinds of stories that Trump will probably want to put forward as success stories of his policies of forcing Michelin to relocate production to the United States.
He's also a deeply stupid man who has held this belief in tariffs since the 80s. He's also a gangster who is trying to force people to the table. And he has this vision of the 1890s as this the Gilded Age, one of the last ages of oligarchs in the United States, as something to emulate. The income tax. Where did the income tax? Why the income tax? They're cutting the FDA. They want to go back to the age of, I don't know if anyone has read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. There's a reason why there are food inspectors. Upton Sinclair writes a very graphic, detailed explanation of what the meat industry in Chicago was like. Like he has this vision of the world that is so cockeyed that he searches for people to back him up. So he found Peter Navarro, who actually, he pardoned him. He went to jail over the election denial stuff. And Peter Navarro actually made up an economist and wrote a book about it. And the made up economist was Peter Navarro. Like,
to be fair, he used an anagram of his own name.
Yes.
To be fair.
So he searches for people to tell him what he wants to hear. And in the first administration, there were adults in the room. There are no more adults in the room. I described them in my opening as sycophants and worm tongues. I don't know if anyone got my Lord of the Rings reference, but he's got people who also have agendas of their own, and they know how to manipulate him because he's a narcissist. So Greg is absolutely right, but he's also a deeply misguided, dumb person who has the ego and the power base to be able to say, I want tariffs. Here, like, we're doing tariffs. And the people around him will say, absolutely, sir. How high?
I think if I could just follow up in 2 ways. One, I think Anna's right, is these are not smart people, but unfortunately, a clown armed with a flamethrower still has a flamethrower, and I think that is a problem. Because in the first Trump administration, there were sensible people around, and this administration, it's sort of anything goes. So one of the big backers of tariffs is this fellow Peter Navarro, who's not very smart himself. Another person is a fellow named Orrin Cass, who's the big believer in using tariffs, as I think you mentioned, to raise revenue so that you can basically get rid of the income tax by replacing that with tariffs. He's not an economist. He has no economic training. He's a lawyer of some sort. Again, no, not making fun of lawyers in the room. He has no economic training. So he just has these bizarre thoughts. And these are the kind of people who are pointed around. Again, an example would be Robert F. Kennedy. Whatever your views on vaccines or something, I mean, he's anti-science, he's anti-evidence, and he's opened the door to the most bizarre kind of thinking. And I just saw today he's wanting to register all Americans who have autism. When a government starts registering people who are minorities of some sort, I mean, that's not a good sign. So it's the kind of most bizarre kinds of quackery ideas are now, many of them discredited from the period of big quackery in America. The 1890s, are back in vogue, and it's wild to consider the we're in a university, the anti-intellectualism, which is, has a long strain in American thought, but that now to the fore, again, to talk about the wrecking of American power, American universities, American kind of research, scientific, medical kind of research is world changing. We live in, maybe up till 2025, the most scientifically advanced kind of society in human history. And that's being gutted by the American government. It's the most bizarre kind of self-harm that's going on in America.
There are scientists and medical researchers who have said we were on the cusp of a cure, of a discovery that would be groundbreaking, and they pulled the grant money out from under us, or they destroyed our database, wiped like the data is gone. It took us years to get to this point. We can't replicate it, and the United States has been the central hub of the WHO. Things like tracking the flus that are circulating around the world that would go into the flu shot. The United States pulled out of that organization. Like, we in Canada will be impacted, not just by the tariffs, by the immense loss of the medical science research, all of that. We will be immensely impacted around the world by things like this. Cutting things like, it's a Women's Health Institute that discovered a gene for breast cancer, saved millions of women's lives. They cut the contract. It was $10 million a year. That discovery helped women in this room and generations of women to come, and they were doing more research around menopause and osteoporosis and things like that. Gone. Done. Closed.
But doctor, just like $10 million is the cost of a missile. I mean, you got to have priorities.
I realize that.
It's a rounding error. For the U.S. government, $10 million is a rounding error.
Right.
It's bizarre. Anyway.
Right. Or a Dogecoin.
Thank you very much for putting it in the context of the economy and the tariffs and the mess we're in. I guess my question is, all of this is a human face. So particularly, I think with Dr. Murphy and putting forth the dignity of the human person, do you folks see any way that we can do more about that? We have someone at the UN, we're Sisters of St. Martha, and so we're familiar with most of what you're saying. But at this point, do you see anything, even in the economy, of pulling that dignity of the human person? I'm thinking the most vulnerable, and that's there. And I understand it's really hard to look at that when the economy is falling apart. So, yeah, what would you say to that? Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate your question. I think there's several different things that came to mind when you were speaking. I think that especially for those who are most vulnerable, we already were marginalized. And so to have researchers and activists and community all kind of intertwined together was already a struggle. So now to see like the banning of words, defunding, closing certain departments, women and gender studies in the United States is extra concerning because like we were already on the bottom rung. But I do think that there's still and always is, you know, beauty in connection and in community. And I don't think that's something that can be eliminated with a ban, but the legitimacy and the formality of publication or things like that can kind of go by the wayside. And so that's a major concern, even for like our students. When I was grading papers and some of the research that they were using, coming out of the US, I was like, how long is this research going to be available to them? Because then the image that they'll have of, I don't know, maternal health care or something like that in the United States will be completely changed as certain information becomes delegitimized, and the humanity doesn't. We legitimize certain types of information and certain statures of people that give us information. And so sometimes that impedes the ability for our shared humanity to also come to the stature of academia or politics or governance or something like that. So I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think there's still a lot of potential in community and organizing and bringing things together. So I haven't lost complete hope, but I'm really scared about the research side. And we've talked about things, actually, things that we could do to help people across the border. But even then, and this goes back to your question earlier about what about people in the Republican Party that are still good, right? I've had so many ideas about how to try to reach out and help queer researchers, for example, in the US. And there's a lot of fear about what could happen. You know, one of my ideas was to, like, you know, bring people over and have a conference, and then at least their work would be public here, right? But like, when they cross the border, they could be detained. So it's actually not safe to draw the community to us across the border. So I think we're going to have to find some creative ways to reach out and build that community that kind of goes around the fear and the possibility of being detained or things like that as well. It was kind of all over the place.
And I think something too, one thing that the right, the extreme right, have been really good at is narratival control. They have controlled the narrative. They clearly controlled the vocabulary. They have been really good at doing that for a really long time. And something that the Democrats need to work on is slicing into that and finding stories and taking back as much of that narratival control as they can, and showing people advocating for other people. So we are now starting to see videos of people forming human chains to allow someone that ICE is coming to detain, to block ICE from allowing them access to those people, because there's certain rules around whether or not ICE can go into a person's home. So we have human chains, neighborhoods forming human chains to allow people to access their homes so ICE cannot get them. We have public school principals speaking out about children being detained by ICE. And writing letters. And people, because of what's happening and what Dr. Murphy was just talking about, this is risk-taking behavior to put yourself out there. I mean, I'd like to say we're even here, sitting here, taking a risk, being as honest as we are, sharing our thoughts with you. So there needs to be a take back of the narrative. It's going to be hard work because, like I said, we are working, or they are working, with media that has been largely hijacked to both siderism and basically just allowing Trump's lies to go unfettered, unchecked. And so it'll take hard work But those are the things that people need to do, is to take back like those little steps. Even Senator Van Hollen going down to the jail and trying to see Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That's his name. I did Google that, but going down to see him. Now we have other Democratic reps going to detention centers and trying to see their constituents. I have been particularly disappointed with the Democratic leadership, like Chuck Schumer. There were moments of acquiescence that could have been moments of fight. One of the things that I said, I think in October, was that the Democratic leadership was too old to deal with, and I sincerely apologize for that. I see some very lived, experiential people here, and I appreciate you coming. And I'm not trying to, I'm not saying anything against you, but these are people who have been senators for 30 years. They are millionaires. They are happy to have the position, and they don't want to lose it. And then we have people like Maxwell Frost and AOC, who could be the lifeblood of a new movement. We also, here you go, we have Bernie Sanders, who is drawing tens of thousands of people on his No Oligarchs tour, right? And then we have Chuck Schumer, who basically turns the other cheek and allows the budget to go through when there could have been more pushback on that. So I think that the Democrats need to push for narratival change and control, and they also need to look inside their own party and look at getting or respecting and using the young blood that they do have.
As an historian, America has been in dark places before, and that sort of respect for human dignity is often sort of shone through in some of those dark moments. In the period of slavery, the stories of Frederick Douglass or Harriet Beecher Stowe, or this very, maybe I don't know if you've seen it, but this very famous image of a slave named George with scars all on his back. It's one of the very first photographs. Really changed a lot of opinion in America about what it was like to actually be a slave and the lived experience of that, and fed into the anti-slavery movement. And in the civil rights era, the lynching of Emmett Till, a young boy killed for whistling at a white girl across the street or something. He was horribly tortured, and his mother insisted on an open casket so that people could see. And the press came, and thousands of mourners, to see what it was actually like to be tortured by a member of the white supremacists. And those indelible images of little black girls and boys going to Little Rock school with people throwing things at them and saying the most horrid stuff, or other children going off to be escorted to school by members of the U.S. Airborne. Soldiers having to escort them through these. That kind of imagery really appeals to, I think, the better angels of the nature of people, and some people in America anyway. I don't want to be very pessimistic though, but there's also some people who delight in the torture, who delight in the dehumanization. And that's the troubling part, is that when authoritarian governments come to power, it's not just that they sometimes they seize power, but often they're welcomed in, and there are people who applaud them, and there are people who rejoice in what they're doing, in getting rid of trans people. So it's the pageantry of some of the stuff that's really shocking as well. And so there is very much, I think, a battle for the soul of America going on right now. And there's an evangelical author named David French who wrote a story last year where he was with some parishioners who were questioning whether Jesus Christ was woke because he was talking about doing things like turning the other cheek and loving thy neighbor, turning over the tables at the temple. That seems like woke commie stuff. So there's a sickness in America too, that people, literally Christians, questioning the teachings of Jesus Christ, who I think is pretty fundamental to the whole bloody thing. So there is, I think, a battle in the soul of America going on right now, and it's, you know, I don't know who's winning right now, but anyway, we'll see. But that issue of human dignity, I think, is a really, really important at the forefront, I think, of the battle that's going on, because some people think that some people have dignity, and some people think that there are other people who don't.
And I'll just jump in one more quick thing, which is I think that what you guys have been pointing to is an issue that exists within politics that was there long before Donald Trump as well, which is that there's a prioritization and a polarization that supersedes issues of justice or humanity all the time. But especially now with Donald Trump and the people that he has in his administration, it just amplifies it and makes it worse, right? And there's this like assumption by people, you know, the billionaires in Trump's administration who, you know, build these bunkers and stuff because they think at the end of the world we're all going to kill each other. But when we look at like the wildfires, community was set up right away to help, to bring as much food as they could, to give spaces to people that had lost their homes. Like community keeps coming together, and it's the politics that's vicious, and they're assuming things of us that are not true. And I think also the prioritization, I know we talked a lot about, you know, the economy. I think that one of the problems is that we focus on things like it's the economy. We got to fix the economy. We have to do this. And that becomes like a high politics issue. And then anything else becomes like a we'll get to that when we're not busy issue. And I think that's a problem in politics that was there well before Donald Trump. So I actually think that if the tariff stuff, as you said, kind of goes down and people become less worried about it, I actually think that people will not notice the extreme marginalization of queer folks because, well, if the economy's fine, we're doing okay, right? And I think that's a problem that we need to be looking at, to focus ourselves on the types of things that I was talking about and not just money, because we can have a great economy and people can still be tormented and living horrible lives and being treated poorly.
We've been watching the changes in the United States for the past 10 years or so, and we're watching things change in real time. And it seems as if Donald Trump was able to appeal to a very disgruntled percentage of the population, people that felt they had an axe to grind, they weren't getting a fair shake, people that just didn't feel that things were going their way. And he was able to appeal to them and tell them that he was going to be able to solve their problems, and he understood their angst. And I see some of that mentation or ideation coming across the border into our own country. And having the advantage of seeing what happened in the United States and knowing that it's here in our own country now and it's starting, what can we do? And are there people in positions in our country that would be able to coalesce a think tank and do some research into why do people feel so unhappy that that ideation is appealing to them in our own country now? Like, what are we missing with these people? If we can't ingather these outliers and try to make them feel they have a future in our country and in our system, how do we stop this from taking over in our own country?
I mean, I say there are legitimate frustrations that people have in this country or in the United States. I think it's just a question of how politicians tap into that. So Donald Trump is, I think, not a smart man, I think, as we established in answer to your question. But he's a brilliant politician. And he's harnessed, I think, an anger in America, particularly in the Rust Belt kind of areas, but in other places too, because a lot of his supporters are car dealers and pretty wealthy people like that. But a sense of frustration for cultural reasons, easy. But he's harnessed anger and made it worse. I think in Canada we we don't quite have, there's anger and frustration. I don't know if it's the same kind of scapegoating, I think, is not quite the same. I'm relieved by that, I think. Maybe my panelists disagree a bit, but I don't think we're at the same point at all. It's so how that frustration, is it harnessed in a positive way or harnessed in a negative way to demonize people? Right? It's the fault of Mexicans who are rapists and murderers. It's the fault of gay people. It's the fault of globalists, by which, of course, they mean Jewish people. It's so it's this kind of conspiracy mongering. It's these shadowy figures. It's the media. It's woke academics with glasses and balding. Those kinds of people. Right? So it's where that anger, which is real, for legitimate reasons in many cases. Jobs have been shipped, different places, and people have fallen behind. It's possible to buy a house for many people. How is that anger harnessed, in a positive way or a negative way? Does that make sense? I hope. I think in Canada we've seen far less of that anger harnessed in a negative sense, maybe. Sisters, cover your ears, but there's a fellow in town, maybe he's here, I don't think so though, who has a F. Carney flag, and he had an F. Trudeau flag. He has a Jeep. At Christmas, he had Christmas lights on it. It was very festive. Sorry, sisters. But he quickly changed it. But yeah, there are those angry people. I don't know. Yeah.
That's the American influence. That's Republicanism coming up. And I think that there are more people who think along those lines than we know. I find it deeply, deeply concerning. And something I've said when talking about the upcoming election here was, yes, affordability, housing. Our democracy is actually on the line in this election as well. We have a stark decision to make. And I feel similarly to how I felt in November with the American election. Poilievre didn't change his tune. He maybe, the whistle was a little bit turned down in volume, but he's still talking about Canada first. And pushing these ideas that are clearly taken from the Republican Party. There are people who are talking about, oh, well, we should have Doge do in Canada what they did in the States. And actually it could happen faster in Canada because our system is different. And we would be able to cut through all the red tape. So we could, and talking about it now openly. And that to me is very scary. And there are places that are doing, there's the Environics Institute who does, it's called the Confederation of Tomorrow surveys. And they do polling over several months and gather information from across Canada. And they kind of gather information along those lines, like how are you happy with your government and things like that? What are your stances on climate change and around those lines? But I'm not sure about those sort of hardcore questions that you're asking. But it's scary. And I don't know how to deal with it. Because we're also fighting against a really strong tide, because we're dealing with social media, the manosphere, people like Jordan Peterson, who are just washing over people who are upset about things, feel hard done by. And it just takes that spark. And that person is gone. It lost to the collective, lost to the idea of everyone's humanity. And that to me is really disappointing and really scary. I would like to think that the Canadian voter, I mean, that is kind of the phrase, that does their own research. But when you've got TikTok, basically, when the algorithm shows you what you want to see, you're never going to see the other side. And that's deeply, deeply troubling. And like I said, we have a stark decision to make on Monday, and that will determine which way our country goes. Dr. Murphy and I have talked about this a lot, that what's happening in the States is on a flight to Canada, and it's, universities, research, things like that. We sort of saw this sort of thing under Harper, climate change, all of the things and the progress that we have made gone out the window. So, yeah, thank you for your comment. It's something that I think about a lot.
I might actually have something that's more uplifting, but I'm not sure. We'll see at the end of my talking if I get there or not. But your comment made me think of a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. And in this book, she discusses the origins of totalitarianism. It's like an apt title. And she says that when you look at something like Nazi Germany, for example, how did Hitler come to power, right? He says, well, in order for a totalitarian regime to come to power, they have to harness a large voting public. And in most countries, she says, there is a large and angry non-voting public. And this is true of the United States. People who are angry, who are actually genuinely politically disenfranchised. Nobody is listening to them. Mostly rural white men. Just as Hannah Arendt says happened in Germany, happened in the US, somebody spoke to them. And in any circumstance, if you feel like you're not being listened to, I mean, I even do this in my own research about lesbian visibility. If you feel like nobody's looking at you or paying any attention to you or loves you, right? And then somebody does, you're like, oh, I love you too, right? And so to go back to Hannah Arendt, she says, that's all you need to start a totalitarian regime. Now, here's the plus side part that I started with. I think that the group of people that we're describing who are flirting with this idea are not a non-voting public. They've been voting. So I feel like the percentage of people being pulled from the margins as a non-voting angry public is less. Though I'm saying this as an assumption. I don't have any numbers on this, but I think that it would be generally less scary, a lesser amount of people than in that pool of potential voters in the US. So perhaps that's a positive, that yes, there are people that are, like I said, flirting with these ideas from Trump, but they voted before too. They're not a new segment of voters in the population, and therefore the outcome of the election won't be that different than it has been in the past, perhaps.
There's a scholar named Tim Snyder. He is a scholar of authoritarianism. I mentioned him in January, probably in October as well. And he wrote a book called On Tyranny, and he had a 14-point list of in order what happens as authoritarianism creeps into your country. The United States, we're done, checked all those boxes. And I'm afraid that Canada we're in the 1 to 5. And I see, I'm sorry, I'm not as hopeful as you are, but I am a cynic by nature. I come from humble German origins, so I, carry guilt with me. But I'm afraid that Canada is already working our way down that list. And we do know the trucker convoy was a huge step in that direction. Polyev took pictures, right? We know those things. We know that there are MPs who are best friends with JD Vance. Like, we see the connections, and one of the interesting things is that Timothy Snyder actually fled the United States. He now teaches at the University of Toronto because he was afraid of what would happen to him. And there's another scholar, his name is Jason Stanley, works on authoritarianism as well. He is at the University of Toronto. We see people fleeing the United States. Where do we go as Canadians? So it's hard. We have a fight in front of us as Canadians in terms of not becoming the 51st state, but also to shore up our defenses and our values. And I mean that militarily, geographically, but also in terms of psychologically. What does it mean to be a Canadian? And can we maintain the dignity that we see other people have and hold? And I think that the United States, at least right now, is a lost cause as the resistance comes together. And I think one of the things is that authoritarians, they perform. It's a performance. It's about, I think I mentioned the Oval Office now is covered in gold gilding. It's a decadent, sort of Baroque, tacky, the instead of a tasteful, oh, here's a picture of this president, there's a picture of that, a bust of the, like, it's everything all at once. And that is for him. And that's for his followers. Look what I have done. Look what I have. Look what I've done for you. And then it's also about erasing history. So in terms of the Secretary of Defense, he went on an absolute DEI slash and burn. All sorts of historic, there's that word, historical. The NASA, there was a group of Black African-American women, they were mathematicians, and they came up with the formulas for NASA to get into space. Page gone, 404, like, will not load, gone. Jackie Robinson, gone. It's.
Can I just say, my favorite example is the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima's Enola Gay, and
yep.
And that was purged because it had the name Gay.
Yes. Right. So we have these purges and this rewriting of history. The Stonewall Memorial was changed to take out transgender. Yeah. So, but then what's replaced are new images. So Asa, you were talking about Emmett Till and the photos of the slaves and their backs being whipped. Those images are being replaced by images of Kristi Noem, who went to El Salvador. She's the director of Homeland Security, should be in front of the cages of the jail with half-naked inmates behind her. She was wearing a Rolex and looked like she was just about to go into Starbucks after a workout. But those are the images that are being replaced. Like, it's mind-boggling. But this is what happens in authoritarianism. June 14th, mark this on your calendar. It's Trump's birthday. It's also, I believe, it's the 250th anniversary of the U.S. military, maybe the Army. And he's going to have a military parade. That doesn't happen in the United States. That wasn't supposed to happen in the United States. There's going to be a military parade akin to Russia and North Korea. So these are the things that we need to keep an eye out for, because that's end stage and we are in the creeping stage. So I that's not hopeful, but yeah, I just think education, awareness, seeing the humanity in other people, and holding on to that, and speaking and listening, and bearing witness.
I feel like when this panel's over, we should put like a cat or puppy video up on the screen for everybody before they go, so that they're like cleansed.
Whoever wants a hug, come on up, and an apology probably. But
What I was going to say as a sociologist to your question is get involved in community. I think one of the biggest mistakes that Trudeau made during that truckers debacle was he wouldn't go out and talk to them. I think you're talking about humanity. I think that's the biggest thing, is when people get mad, as said, is when they're not heard or feel like they're not heard. I think if you just walk out and hear them, that's all he had to do, right? Was go out for 10 minutes and listen to them. I think that would have done a world of good. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to start doing that listening, doing those steps, even if it's local. It's amazing when you start making those connections locally, what that does, it blossoms out. So I would really encourage anyone, if you've got the wherewithal, the time, whatever, to be involved in your community in whatever aspect. And one of the great things about being down east is people will say hello to you, and just keep saying hello to people. Because again, you don't know what kind of day they're having. And that hello can make a big difference, can change some of those attitudes. I mean, it's not going to be overnight, but it's those small things that I really think and hold on to as being important.
They bought it cheap, and benefited trillionaires. So I'm thinking, is this all just much more higher up their economic cost? Trillionaires that we're never going to get, or I'm never going to get. Way beyond me.
So Bitcoin is just a form of electronic money. And there are three reasons you want to hold money. You want to buy something, you want to save your money to buy something in the future, or you want to speculate on whether the value of that money is going to rise in the future. So Bitcoin for purchasing, not very useful. If you try to go to a shop here, 99.9% of them will not know what it is. Can't go to Sobeys, use Bitcoin. As a store of wealth, very pathetic because it's very volatile. So if you want to save your tuition money in terms of Bitcoin to pay your tuition in September, may have lost 50% of its value. So not very useful as a store of value. The only reason you may want to hold Bitcoin is as a speculation in the belief that other people will want to hold Bitcoin and therefore drive its price up. Now, the only reason you would want to do that is if you think that traditional forms of money, like the American dollar, like the Canadian dollar, will lose their value to such an extent that they become worthless. That's what happens in situations of hyperinflation, when prices of goods and services could double on a daily basis. So if you get paid $1,000 today, it will lose half its purchasing power by tomorrow. So you don't want to get paid in dollars. You might want to get paid in something else that will hold value. Traditionally, it could be something like gold, which has been used as a form of currency for thousands of years. But cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin have emerged as a possibility. Now, why would you want to hold Bitcoin is if you think the value of the US dollar could fall. How could that happen? If there's inflation in the United States, so the US dollar loses its purchasing power. Could hyperinflation happen? It could, if the political leaders gain control of the central bank and influence its policy. What are you seeing right now? Last week, the president was threatening to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve because he was not lowering interest rates. So the political leaders are starting to gain influence over the central bank. So any episode of hyperinflation throughout history has occurred because of politicians being corrupt, taking over the central bank, printing money to pay their bills, causing the money to lose its value. So as a result, you don't want to hold US dollars if you believe this sort of situation will happen in the United States, but instead you might want to hold another asset like cryptocurrency. So I'll leave that as an open question right now. Is the United States going down this path where they may try to inflate their country to such an extent that the US dollar won't be worth holding anymore, and therefore the only people who will preserve their wealth will be those holding alternative assets like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin?
So we're all up a creek without a paddle.
Just one question for everyone on the panel. I'm kind of nearing the end here, I guess. Here's your thoughts. Whoever has to make that phone call to Trump for the election, what's your advice? Is there things you can draw from past historical relationships that have always been great between prime minister and president? More generally, what's your advice if you're the political advisor, whoever has to make that call? On anything. Anything you want to advise to a person who might be a president.
He is the prime minister.
Well, he is for you.
Well, again, you have, thinking about Trump, if you want to influence him, you have to speak his language. The only thing he understands would be something related to money, right? So if you put it in terms that he can understand, it's like, Donald, if you follow policy A, it's going to cost each American citizen $2,000 per year, right? Do you want to go down this path, or do you want to go down the other path where Americans will become wealthier? So maybe someone has to explain it in terms of option A, option B. And I think Mark Carney would be a good person to do that, given that he does have the central banking background, Goldman Sachs background, and he is learning the politics now, so might be able to get into Trump's ear and convey this in a way that he can understand.
I would tell whoever that person is to stay on the phone and not meet Donald Trump in person until you really have to, until there's some potential deal, until your advisors have actually sort of maybe hammered something out. Because the politics of that for either potential prime minister, I'm not going to include Mr. Singh here, but Mr. Poilievre or Mr. Carney, could either make it look like, again, you're junior Trump, in the case of Mr. Poilievre, which will not look good, or you end up in a Zelensky situation where you're in the chair of shame in the Oval Office getting screamed at by J.D. Vance and the rest of the grim kind of people. So I would stay on the phone. I would wait maybe till the G7 meeting in Kananaskis in June to meet in person, perhaps. And I would hope that sensible people who understand how modern economies work and the integrated nature of our economies could hammer out some sort of tariff relief or something, pending a further negotiation of the USMCA or CUSMA agreement. But this is one of the things that was actually happening in the first Trump administration, was there was a lot of lobbying and kind of back and forth by all kinds of other people besides Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump, on the understanding that that Donald Trump was a wild card kind of character. And so I think that's a viable approach, again, is to negotiate with the other people and leave Mr. Trump out of it as long as possible.
I definitely wouldn't envy the person on that call, whoever it is. And I don't know even if I would have any political advice for them. But I would say, and you mentioned this earlier, like, he's a narcissist. And so, well, talking to him in numbers, I think is a good thing. I think maybe even just reading up on narcissism before you go into that call, so you don't put yourself in a situation where he's just trying to best you, right? And what's the point? Then just don't call, right? Unless you need to. So I would say prepare yourself for irrational conversation and not to engage with it,
Yeah, have a therapy sesh for yourself and get some. I was literally thinking that, like, talk to a psychologist. You will be talking to a deeply unwell person who is showing signs of dementia and is a malignant narcissist. And as Asa was saying, don't go to a second location. If you know your true crime, never go to the second location. And because those photo ops in the Oval Office are points of power for Trump. And you really aren't going to be negotiating with him. You will have to do some creative dancing around, but also know that whatever he says will come out in front of the media as something completely different. He will bold-faced lie about whatever conversation you had with him, and record it. Let there be tapes. I think, who was it? James Comey said, "Oh Lordy, I wish there are tapes. I hope there are tapes." Record it for posterity and for the actual truth. But know that you are not negotiating in good faith ever with him, and now with the people around him as well. And I also wouldn't want to get caught in a conversation with Stephen Miller. So I would leave that to somebody completely else. If you know Stephen Miller, he's the Goebbels of the Trump administration, who likes to shriek at the media. So anyways, he's one of the worm tongue sycophants that I was mentioning. Anyways, I'd also say good luck to you, sir. Yeah, we'll see you on the other side. Sir, ma'am, good luck to you.
All right, I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Katz, Dr. McKercher, Dr. Murphy, Dr. Juschlag, for giving their time and insights tonight, and for you to attending. I'd like to end on a bit of a lighter note. So, in the spirit of Jean Chrétien, his piece that he did just after Christmas, CBC Jeff Douglas, his new Joe Canada rant, Tom Green's I'm a Canadian, and Mike Myers' Elbow Up. Yes, I'm Gen X, as you notice all the examples I have pulled. I'd like to recycle my reinterpretation of the monologue given by Hugh Grant's character in Love Actually about relationships with the United States. For those of you that don't remember the scene, it's a press conference after some tense negotiations between the Americans and British officials. And my reinterpretation would go something like this, without the posh British accent. I love the word relationship. Covers all manners of sins, doesn't it? I fear this has become a bad relationship, a relationship based on the president taking exactly what he wants and casually ignoring all those things that really matter to Canada. We are a relatively small country, although big in size, but we are a great one too. The country of Mulroney, Chrétien, Tommy Douglas, Shania, Celine, and Joni. Sidney Crosby's left shot and Sidney Crosby's right shot, come to that. And a friend who bullies us is no longer a friend. And since bullies only respond to strength, from now on, we'll be prepared to be much stronger. And the president should be prepared for that too. Mike Myers' words, elbows up. Thanks, folks. Have a lovely night. Safe travels.